Kamala Harris is running for president, and she announced her candidacy in one of the most platitude-driven, thumb-point-heavy ads I've seen in quite some time. Take a look.
Truth, justice, decency, equality, freedom, democracy. These aren't just words. They're the values we as Americans cherish, and they're all on the line now. The future of our country depends on you and millions of others lifting our voices to fight for our American values. That's why I'm running for President of the United States. I'm running to lift those voices, to bring our voices together. So please join me in Oakland on Sunday, January 27th, and go to kamalaharris.org to join our campaign. Let's do this together. Let's claim our future for ourselves, for our children, and for our country. I'll see you in Oakland.
I don't mean to be Captain Obvious here, but there wasn't a single policy proposal in that entire announcement ad. Now, if you're running for president, you'd think that the candidate would want to put that front and center, but nonetheless, there was nothing. And when you go to Kamala Harris's website, you still don't see much policy proposals. In fact, you see none. However, at this stage, she does have a store up. So if you want to purchase a hat or a shirt, you can do that. But with that being said, to be fair, I do like what I've seen from her with regard to the policy proposals she's alluded to supporting. So, for example, she supports Medicare for All. She co-sponsored Bernie Sanders' Medicare for All bill. She claims that she wants to legalize marijuana. Now, that's all good because unlike Hillary Clinton and candidates from the 2016 presidential cycle, she's actually listening to what the base wants. She's looking at polls, seeing what's popular, and then she is trying to accommodate what the base wants. But with that being said, is it likely that she's taking all of these progressive policy positions, which she didn't support a couple of years ago, for purposes of political expediency? Yes, it's very likely that that's the case, and we can parse that out in a different video because I do think that individuals like Cory Booker, Kirsten Gillibrand, and Kamala Harris are all trying to be progressive because they want to defeat Bernie Sanders, who is probably their biggest competition going into 2020. But with that being said, I don't want to look at Kamala Harris's policy platform right now. I want to look at Kamala Harris's record and be thorough here because she is someone who is going to be a pretty big candidate going into 2020. She's a force. And I say that because a lot of Hillary Clinton's former support base already seems to be lining up behind her, and also she seems to be the media's favorite. So for example, CNN is literally hosting a town hall just for her in Iowa, the very first caucus state that tends to make or break candidates. They didn't do this for Bernie back in 2016, but they're doing it for Kamala. So that says a lot. And when you factor in California's decision to move up her home state's primary, presumably to give her an early lead and pledge delegates, in addition to the fact that Clinton's donors already anointed her as the candidate of their choice, I mean, I do think that she does have a chance of winning. So with that being said, is she as bad as Hillary Clinton as a candidate? No, I do think that she's more politically astute. Can she beat Donald Trump? It's possible. I don't think she has as good of a chance as Bernie Sanders, but simply put, I do think she's a serious candidate with a real chance. So with that being said, it is important that we look at her record and we examine what Kamala Harris did as Attorney General, because she previously characterized herself as a progressive prosecutor. Now, I don't know if you instinctively believe her when she says that, but if, what she did in your view, has any importance when it comes to the implications of what she'd push for as president, then sure, her record is really important. So what I want to do is take the time to go into her record, her previous record, her own actions, and determine what was and what wasn't progressive. And when you look at Kamala Harris's record in a vacuum, when you put aside electability, when you put aside, her policy platform, when you just look at her record, there's a lot of red flags for progressives that make it very difficult to support her going into 2020. Now, I'm doing this for people who are unsure who to support. because I know a lot of my viewers are supporting Bernie Sanders because he is the furthest left candidate who's the most trustworthy. But for Kamala Harris, there's a lot of people that might instinctively support her for purposes of electability because they think she's progressive because she claims to be a progressive prosecutor. But as Laura Bazelon of the New York Times points out, Kamala Harris was not a progressive prosecutor. And I agree with this because when you look at her record, when you look at her tenure as California's Attorney General, well, she has a history of prosecuting the poor while simultaneously protecting the powerful. Now, you may think that that's not important, that her past record is meaningless, but I think going into 2020, in the event she's elected president, this will give us a sense of how she'd govern, how her policies would look on a broader scale, her views on justice on a broader scale. So getting to that article, as Bazelon explains, time after time, when progressives urged her to embrace criminal justice reforms as district attorney and then the state's attorney general, Miss Harris opposed them or stayed silent. Most troubling, Miss Harris fought tooth and nail to uphold wrongful convictions that had been secured through official misconduct that included evidence tampering, false testimony, and suppression of crucial information by prosecutors. Consider her record as San Francisco's district attorney from 2004 to 2011. Ms. Harris was criticized in 2010 for withholding information about a police laboratory technician who had been accused of intentionally sabotaging her work and stealing drugs from the lab. After a memo surfaced showing that Ms. Harris deputies knew about the technician's wrongdoing and recent conviction, but failed to alert defense lawyers, a judge condemned Ms. Harris's indifference to the systemic violation of the defendant's constitutional rights. Ms. Harris contested the ruling by arguing that the judge, whose husband was a defense attorney and had spoken publicly about the importance of disclosing evidence, had a conflict of interest. Ms. Harris lost. More than 600 cases handled by the corrupt technician were dismissed. Ms. Harris also championed state legislation under which parents whose children were found to be habitually truant in elementary school could be prosecuted despite concerns that it would disproportionately affect low-income people of color. Ms. Harris was simply regressive as the state's attorney general. When a federal judge in Orange County ruled that the death penalty was unconstitutional in 2014, Ms. Harris appealed. In a public statement, she made the bizarre argument that the decision undermines important protections that our courts provide to defendants. The approximately 740 men and women awaiting execution in California might disagree. Now, I just want to pause right there because when she refers to herself as a progressive prosecutor, it's clear that that was not the case. Her record as a prosecutor has historically been conservative and regressive, as Bazelon points out. But it's not just that she wasn't progressive, it's that her record was bereft of morality. And she took positions that were conservative. It gets worse from here. So, for example, when it comes to the legalization of recreational marijuana, she was asked about whether or not she'd support this in 2014 because she had a challenger who did support it. And she made it very clear that her position on marijuana was that legalization of it was laughable, literally.
Your opponent, Ron Gold, has said that he is for the legalization of marijuana recreationally. Your thoughts on that?
That he's entitled to his opinion.
Yeah. Now understand that in America, it's basically already the case that marijuana is legal for white Americans. Because even if it's the case that whites and blacks smoke marijuana at comparable rates, well, it's mostly black Americans, people of color, who are prosecuted and punished for it. Now, as a prosecutor, you'd think she'd be cognizant of this fact, but she wasn't back then. Now, you might say, well, that was her previous stance. She supports the legalization of marijuana now, Mike, so what's the problem? And I hear you, but she only came around to it in 2018, last year. Long past the time when other people in the Democratic Party had already jumped on board with legalization. Now, additionally, when you look at other policy issues, knowing that we are now in the era of Black Lives Matter, as Brianna Greyjoy points out in an Intercept article recently, you'd think that as a, quote, progressive prosecutor, she'd be extremely concerned with state-sanctioned violence and extrajudicial killing of black Americans, and maybe she was, but the policies that she supported, or more specifically, the policies she opposed, are contradictory to the cause of Black Lives Matter. So, for example, in 2014, she tried to block the release of nonviolent second strike offenders because prisons would lose free labor. Stop and think about that. Prisons were overcrowding, so they decided, well, why don't we release second strike nonviolent offenders? Kamala Harris said, no, we shouldn't do that because prisons would lose out on free labor. So she essentially defended modern-day slavery. Also, in 2015, she opposed a bill that required her office to investigate police shootings and didn't support body cameras on police. Now, has her position since changed? It may very well be the case, but as a prosecutor, she was against this. And it's not just like she was against issues that affected people of color, and the Black Lives Matter movement specifically, because in 2015, she opposed a transgender inmate's plea for gender confirmation surgery. If you're a prisoner, sorry, you can't have gender confirmation surgery. That's just not something that a progressive prosecutor, a quote progressive prosecutor, would do. In fact, I'd argue that it's immoral. Now, there's one case in particular that really speaks to the immorality of Kamala Harris as a prosecutor, and this is a case involving a man named George Gage in California. So he was an electrician with no criminal record, and he was accused of sexually abusing his stepdaughter. Now, the reason why he was ultimately convicted was because of his stepdaughter's testimony. However, after he was convicted, the judge learned that the prosecutor broke the law and intentionally withheld evidence that would have cleared his name, including medical reports that proved she lied, including the fact that her own mother described her as a pathological liar. So obviously, when you're wrongfully convicted and it's proven that you were wrongfully convicted, you appeal the case. Well, what did Kamala Harris do once this case was appealed? Well, when it reached the Court of Appeals, Kamala Harris chose to defend the conviction and essentially argued that it was his fault that he was wrongfully convicted because he didn't point out the evidence that was being withheld. Now, understand that this man was an electrician. He was no legal expert, and he was representing himself during this case, and he didn't have his own attorney. Now, what the judges did was send this case to mediation, and at that point, you'd expect that this would lead to just Kamala Harris choosing to dismiss the case altogether since it's going to mediation. It's kind of their cue to back down. And at that point, everyone already knew that he was in fact wrongfully convicted. The question, rather, was, does this man deserve to serve out a 70-year sentence? All based on a technicality because he didn't know that he was supposed to bring up the fact that the prosecutor was intentionally withholding evidence. Really, does he deserve to serve 70 years because of that? Well, Kamala Harris thought so, and she chose to not back down, and since she refused to budge, this man, who was proven to be wrongfully convicted, is still in prison till this very day because of Kamala Harris. She alone ruined his life. Why? Because of a technicality. 70 years. Now, it gets even worse than there because that case is not an outlier. Ms. Harris also fought to keep Daniel Larson in prison on a 28-year-to-life sentence for possession of a concealed weapon, even though his trial lawyer was incompetent and there was compelling evidence of his innocence. Relying on a technicality again, Ms. Harris argued that Larson failed to raise his legal arguments in a timely fashion. This time, she lost. She also defended Johnny Baca's conviction for murder, even though judges found a prosecutor presented false testimony at the trial. She relented only after a video of the oral argument received national attention and embarrassed her office. And then there's Kevin Cooper, the death row inmate whose trial was infected by racism and corruption. He sought advanced DNA testing to prove his innocence, but Ms. Harris opposed it. After the New York Times expose of the case went viral, she reversed her position. All this is a shame because the state's top prosecutor has the power and the imperative to seek justice. In cases of tainted convictions, that means conceding error and overturning them. Rather than fulfilling that obligation, Ms. Harris turned legal technicalities into weapons so she could cement injustices. Now, that's just a few anecdotes, but stepping back and looking at the bigger picture, seeing the broad impact Kamala Harris had, well, as Hannah Georges of The Atlantic explains, under District Attorney Kamala Harris, the overall felony conviction rate in San Francisco rose from 52% in 2003 to 67% in 2006, the highest seen in a decade. Many of the convictions accounting for that increase stemmed from drug-related prosecutions, which also soared from 56% in 2003 to 74% in 2006. Now, on top of all of these injustices, there's also a component of hypocrisy that needs to be examined. Because in her book that she recently released, she literally talks about how, quote, America has a deep and dark history of people using the power of the prosecutor as an instrument of injustice, and she talks about how she saw firsthand how prosecutors would actually hide evidence that would have exonerated defendants. So that's what she talked about in her book, all while conveniently not mentioning the fact that she did these things that she denounced in her book. Now, to be fair to Kamala, it wasn't as if the totality of her record was bad, that she was a regressive prosecutor 100% of the time, because she did do things that did help people. As Attorney General of California, she required officers to undergo implicit bias training, and she also created a program that let first-time nonviolent offenders have their charges dismissed if they completed vocational training. And this is all really positive things that probably had a positive impact on thousands of lives, but that doesn't erase the suffering she chose to inflict on people as a prosecutor. And when you juxtapose her treatment of the poor with the way she handled crimes committed by the rich and the powerful, well, the picture gets even worse. And it gets a lot worse. Because you'd think that if she's this tough-on-crime prosecutor, then she's going to treat the poor and the powerful the same, right? There's not going to be two standards of justice. She's not going to lay out this two-tiered approach to justice just because someone's powerful, right? Well, unfortunately, not necessarily. Because when Steve Mnuchin, current Treasury Secretary for Donald Trump's administration, repeatedly broke the law in California while he ran One West Bank and illegally foreclosed on residents and violated waiting period statutes, Kamala's response was troubling, to say the least. Now, this was determined to be the case, that they were breaking the law repeatedly after a year-long investigation concluded that there were more than 1,000 instances of legal violations from One West Bank, and it recommended that then Attorney General Kamala Harris take action against this bank. Now, when you look at how aggressive she was at prosecuting just normal Americans, including people who were wrongfully convicted, proven to be wrongfully convicted, she's going to be especially hard on this elite Steve Mnuchin, who's running One West Bank that's illegally foreclosing on residents in California, right? Well, actually, no. After it was recommended that her office take action, Kamala Harris inexplicably chose to not take action, to do nothing. She chose not to prosecute One West Bank and Steve Mnuchin. Now, why would this be the case? If you're tough on crime, then you're going to be tough on crime everywhere. You're going to treat the poor the same way you're going to treat the powerful. And if the powerful break the laws, you're going to hold them to the same standard as the poor. So what's going on here? And when she was asked why she chose not to prosecute Steve Mnuchin, she just said, well, it's a decision that my office made. But wait, that doesn't make any sense. You prosecuted hundreds, if not thousands, of other individuals for possibly doing less, but when it's determined that Steve Mnuchin and One West Bank committed more than 1,000 legal violations, you're just going to randomly choose to give them a pass when your whole career you've been pretty tough on crime? This doesn't make sense. Something's not adding up. And her explanation of, oh, well, it's just something we decided to do, doesn't suffice, because you need to tell us why. What's your reasoning? Why would you do this? Well, there's a very specific reason as to why she chose not to prosecute Steve Mnuchin. And this is where her record takes a really dark and nefarious turn. Kamala Harris received a campaign contribution of $2,000 from Steve Mnuchin. But before that, in 2011, Mnuchin's wife at the time gave her multiple campaign contributions, nearly $9,000 worth, and in 2010, One West Bank contributed $6,500 to Kamala Harris's Attorney General campaign. In other words, she was bought off. That's why she chose to not prosecute Steve Mnuchin, who then went on to become Treasury Secretary. This is corruption. Now, it may not be a direct quid pro quo. Maybe there wasn't this agreement that, hey, I'm going to give you money and in turn don't ever prosecute me, but certainly in contributing to Kamala Harris's campaigns multiple times, what Steve Mnuchin, as the head of One West Bank, was doing was trying to curry favor with the California Attorney General. Because in the event their crimes do get exposed, well, maybe she'd go easy on them. And that's exactly what she did. So while Kamala Harris was aggressive in prosecuting people, one of which, after it was proven that he was wrongfully convicted, she chose to give Steve Mnuchin a pass. And maybe the response will be, well, look, maybe this was just a coincidence. Maybe this was a one-off. Maybe this doesn't speak to the broader approach she takes to prosecuting the powerful. Maybe she did prosecute other people who were powerful. Maybe that's the case, but there was another individual named Robert Murray whose defense she came to. And this is someone who was a state prosecutor, and she came to his defense after, quote, he falsified a defendant's confession that was used to threaten a sentence of life in prison. So now it's the case that while she runs for president, she's going to try to frame her record as her being a progressive prosecutor. And you have to be nuanced here. You have to understand that she could point to dozens of examples of wonderful things that she did. And, you know, it's not as if 100% of her record is bad, but certainly there are very troubling instances of her being a regressive prosecutor that she doesn't really want to talk about, conveniently so. So while she tries to convince you that she is a progressive prosecutor, she needs to explain why she acted like a dirty cop in numerous instances throughout her career as a prosecutor. Now let's go back to her ad. What were the platitudes that she was espousing at the beginning of that ad?
Truth, justice, decency, equality, freedom, democracy.
Yeah, those are all principles that the left believes in, but the problem is that we have reason to believe that Kamala Harris didn't put those principles into practice while she was a prosecutor. Now, I want to end this video by sharing a tweet from an activist from the Bay Area who said this when he learned that Kamala Harris announced her candidacy for the presidency. Kamala Harris made her career by locking up black people in the Bay Area. Her track record consists of terrorizing black communities through the prison industrial complex. She then became the top cop of California. Her track record consists of rampant anti-blackness. And as someone who knows better than anyone about her record, that's a devastating thing to say about Kamala Harris. So let's step back and put this all in context. We're looking at her record. We're not looking at her future platform. We're looking at her record because perhaps there's information in there that will tell us how she's going to govern as president of the United States. And if she governs in a way that's even remotely similar to how she acted as a prosecutor, then as Gian Journal puts it, we can expect progress for the rich and prosecution for the poor, because this is chains you can believe in. Yeah, and unfortunately, this is something that is not going to go away. It's something that she needs to address and tell us why she chose to do the things that she did. Why did she choose to prosecute Gage after it was determined that he was wrongfully convicted? Why did she defend the use of slave labor in prisons? These are all things that, in my view, don't make you a progressive prosecutor. It's antithetical to progressivism, and if she wants to truly prove to us that she's progressive, then she needs to put out a detailed and thorough account as to why she did what she did when she was a prosecutor. Now, you can say that that's all in the past, and her new record as a progressive is better, and that's fine, but understand that I do think that this information about her past is important. You can disagree with that or not, but we have to look at these candidates and vet them and determine who's the best. And with a record like that, I don't know how anyone can support Kamala Harris if they are truly on the left, because there is someone with a consistent record being on the right side of history, and that person is Bernie Sanders, not Kamala Harris.